Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Silkman, and I just wanted to say a few words about the sad and very unexpected passing of Richard McAdam, who was also affectionately known as Erekose and also Captain Crunch. I just want to say, and it's not easy to get the right words, and a lot of people have expressed their tributes and have said a lot of wonderful things. But I just wanted to say a few personal things about Richard. I remember joining the Making a Murderer community several years ago, and I remember turning to YouTube, and one of the largest YouTubers on the subject matter was Erekose, and I could remember watching a lot of his videos with interest and intent, and I was amazed by his passion for the cause, and he's done a lot of work and videos on wrongful convictions, not only looking at the Steven and Brendan Dassey cases, but also many other cases involving wrongful convictions. And I really want to say that Richard, for me, was a personal inspiration. He really got me started in this venture about wrongful convictions. And my main focus, of course, is looking at Steve Avery and Brendan Dassey. What impressed me about Richard was his passion, enthusiasm, and the tireless work he did on these causes. He was always producing videos on the subject matter, as well as doing a lot of readings on documents, and it was really fascinating. I was blessed to be part of his channel. I subscribed very early on. I met a lot of lovely people, engaged in a lot of conversations, but really the highlight for me was actually talking one-on-one with Richard. He kindly invited me to the Mammothon 2020, which of course was this year, and both Richard and I had a fantastic discussion on Brendan Dassey, and I could remember having Richard in stitches, as you can see here in the diagram, and we both had a ball, and we both learnt a real lot, and it was awesome. I know that the research community, his family and his friends are hurting because we truly have lost a true champion. He's one of the hardest workers I've ever seen, and to pass away suddenly at 44 is just way too young, and it's been a shock to all of us in the community. But we must never forget he was one of the first pioneers in this field, and he opened my eyes, and also to thousands of his supporters all around the world, and we really must carry on the torch that he really lit for us, especially in this area. And I see Erekose as this guy here, his namesake. Yeah, it's just amazing. There are wrongful convictions everywhere, all around the world, including my own country. And Erekose really shone the light. And as the comic says, Erekose, the internal champion. And that indeed he was. And what I like to do is I like to dedicate this presentation that I'm about to give to him and his memory, and to personally thank him for giving me the courage and the inspiration to continue on this path. Thank you very much, Richard. I appreciate it. Welcome everybody to today's presentation. My name is Dr. Silkman and I'm from the Foul Play team. The title of today's presentation is called Culhane and Steven Avery, a 20-year forensic nightmare. And in today's presentation, I'd like to cover the following topics. First of all, I want to ask the question, did the MTSO and or the WSCL have any biological samples from Steven Avery prior to his arrest in November 2005? Who uploaded Steven Avery's genomic STR-DNA profile into the convicted offender database prior to 2005? I also like to have a look at a bit of speculation here, and that is, how could Steven Avery be framed or implicated for the murder or for the alleged murder of Teresa Halbach? Now remember, if you're going to frame somebody, you need biological material from that individual, either blood or DNA. And I think I've uncovered some biological evidence that was being held. And that's what I'm going to be going through in this presentation. Now, what we need to do is start at the beginning and look at this in a stepwise fashion. Okay, well, what we know is that Culhane had performed all the forensic analysis in the Steven Avery cases in 1985, in 2003, and also in 2005. And Ken Kratz, who was a special prosecutor in the Steven Avery trial, said the following about Culhane, and I quote, "Well, that same woman, Culhane, processes this vehicle because she's the unit head. Because this is such an important case, she does the work herself. She does all of the analysis of all of the blood that's found in these cases." Furthermore, Ken Kratz also said, and I quote, "Mr. Avery achieved some degree of notoriety back in 2003 when he was exonerated for a 1985 sexual assault conviction." Now, what is truly remarkable here is that Culhane had a 20-year forensic history involving Steven Avery. It dated back all the way to 1985 right to 2005. A very long history indeed. So let's first start with the disappearance of Teresa Halbach on the 31st of October 2005. This is really where our story begins. So as you can see here, there were flyers that were produced for Teresa Halbach, and it had details about her, as well as the vehicle that she was driving at the time. Now, forensic evidence was found at the Avery salvage yard. We know that Pamela and Nicole Sturm found a Toyota RAV4 on the Avery salvage yard on November the 5th, 2005. Also on November the 8th, a Toyota RAV4 key was found inside Steven Avery's bedroom. Now, it's important to realize that the forensic evidence was mainly processed by Culhane. Now, what is remarkable here is that Culhane had assigned herself to the Steven Avery case in 2005. And I quote, this is from the trial. Question: "You take steps to be sure that the person assigned to a case has no stake in the outcome of the case or the test? Answer: that's correct. Question: all right, and indeed it's your assumption that when evidence comes to you from a police agency, it's your assumption that the police have also taken similar stakes or similar steps to make sure that nobody connected with the suspect has been involved in the collection of the evidence, isn't it? Attorney Gunn: objection, Your Honour. Speculation. Attorney Buting: asking for assumption. The court: she can answer. Answer: okay, obviously I don't know any of this for a fact, but I would make the assumption that evidence came in from the police agency was maintained integrity. Question: and collected from somebody who had no connection to the case, you would hope? Answer: yes. Question: okay, now in this case, I believe you said that some of your duties involve case flow and case management, right? Answer: correct. Question: does that also involve assigning particular analysts to a particular case? Answer: yes. Question: but in this case, you assigned yourself. Answer: correct. Question: all right, and that's a decision that you make and yours alone? Answer: most of the time, sometimes my supervisor makes that decision, but in this case, I made the decision, which is very, very interesting when one considers Cherie Culhane's past association with Steven Avery. So the question for me is, what was Culhane's motivation for doing this? Why did she assign herself to Steven Avery's case? Now, let's have a look at the forensic evidence. Now, the Toyota RAV4 was taken to the crime lab, and it was designated item A. This particular vehicle was placed into evidence on the 7th of November. There was also another vehicle, and in this case it was labelled item B, and it was Steven Avery's Pontiac Grand Am. That particular vehicle was submitted into evidence on the 8th of November 2005, and that also was brought to the crime lab as well for processing. Now, if we have a look at this report was done by Cherie Culhane. So what she did is that she took swabs of stains in the Toyota RAV4, and these items were labelled item A1, A2, etc. In addition, she also took swabs of Steven's Pontiac Grand Am, and they were labelled item B1, B2, etc. The other thing she took a swab of was item C, and that was the Toyota RAV4 key that was found in Steven Avery's bedroom on November the 8th. Now note, no blood was noted on that key, but Cherie Culhane did a swab of the key, the black portion of the key anyway. All right, now if we have a look at the analysis, the very early analysis of Cherie Culhane's report, in essence, 2 genomic STR DNA profiles were found in the Toyota RAV4. And so what Cherie Culhane would have done, she would have taken a swab of a stain, and that's known as an item swab. She would have prepared genomic DNA from the swab. She would have done a PCR STR analysis and then obtain an STR DNA profile, and we can see that on the right hand side in the table. And I quote, "The profile developed from items A1 and A14 are consistent with originating from the same female individual. The profile developed from items A6, A8, A9, A12, B1, B3, B4, B5, and C are consistent with originating from the same male individual. Now, at that stage, Cherie Culhane had no idea who had deposited their DNA, but something very, very interesting took place. And what I'm going to go through is identify how the male DNA profile from the Toyota RAV4 was actually picked up or identified. And I quote, this is from Cherie Culhane's report. A keyboard search of the profile from item A6 on November the 10th, 2005 against the Wisconsin DNA Data Bank resulted in a match to a DNA profile contained in the convicted offender index. The information regarding this convicted offender sample is as follows. Lo and behold, who pops up but Steven Allen Avery. Now, why is this so unusual and interesting? Well, it just so happened that at the time, Steven Avery, who was exonerated in 2003 for the 1985 wrongful conviction of the sexual assault, attempted murder, and false imprisonment of Penny Beernsten, he just happened to have a $36 million civil lawsuit against the Manitowoc County, former Sheriff Thomas Kosarik, and its former District Attorney Dennis Vogel. Now, both Kosarik and Vogel were about to be deposed, but when Steven Avery was arrested, their depositions were halted. So in the same report, Cherie Culhane wrote the following. This match should be considered an investigative lead. Confirmation of this DNA match requires the submission of a biological standard from this individual to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory, Madison. And in conclusion, now note what she wrote. A biological standard from Steven Allen Avery must be submitted to this laboratory for confirmation of the match to the STR DNA profile obtained from item A6. The DNA profile developed from items A1 and A14 is consistent with originating from the same female individual. Any further interpretation will require the submission of additional biological standards. An evidence disposition, all items will be returned to the submitting agency upon completion of all analysis. So guys, this is very, very interesting. So what did we know? We knew at that very early stage, the male who left their DNA in the RAV4, the Grand Dam, and on the key was Steven Avery. The female who left their DNA in the RAV4 was unknown at that time. Now, as soon as those results were obtained, the state immediately implicated Steven Avery in Teresa's murder. And as you know, Steven Avery was arrested on November the 9th, 2005. He was interrogated by investigators Mark Wieger and Tom Fassbender. Now, what is interesting is that Mark Wieger told Steven Avery the following, and I quote, "How does your DNA get inside of her car?" And Steven Avery, looking shocked and surprised, said, "That's because they got blood out of me." Now, what is interesting is that as we've seen, the Wisconsin DNA Databank search wasn't done until November the 10th, 2005. So it begs the question, how did Mark Wiegert actually know the search result one day in advance? Was he acting like Nostradamus, or was he basically lying? Because remember, an investigator is permitted to lie to a witness or a suspect. But that's very, very interesting that Mark Wiegert would say such a comment even before they knew whose DNA, which male had left that DNA sample. Now, this of course played into the hands of the MTSO and other law enforcement officers. And as you can see, Sheriff Jerry Pagel said, and I quote, "Never been in Teresa Halbach's vehicle. We now know that's a lie." And that's all based on the blood that was found in the car. And of course, that blood, the DNA belonged to Steven Avery. Of course, we had Ken Kratz, who gave a pre-trial press conference on November the 11th. That's one day after the results were obtained. And he stated at the press conference, and I quote, "No longer a question, who is responsible for the death of Teresa Halbach?" So straight away, the spotlight and the finger was pointed at Steven Avery and Steven Avery only at such an early stage. So this goes to show the persuading power of the forensic DNA evidence that was used to condemn Steven Avery from the get-go. Okay, now Cherie Culhane was actually questioned about the searching of the state convicted offender database. Question, now you generate a DNA profile based on the presence of different alleles at these different loci, correct? Answer, yes. Question, okay, and then did you compare that to the DNA databank, Wisconsin DNA databank? Answer, originally, yes. Question, so that was the first thing you did? Answer, after I generated the profile, I requested a keyboard search through the Milwaukee databank. Question, okay, why did you do that? Answer, because I was asked to do that. Question, by who? Answer, the police department. There was my initial testing indicated that it was a male individual. I did not have any samples from anyone. So we thought someone may be in there that matched. So we did a keyboard search. I think between myself and the DCI agents, and I don't remember who, we had a discussion and it was decided that we would do it. Question, okay, how broad a keyboard search did you do? Answer, I did not actually do it. Matt Haas did it. Dan Haas did it, who is the in charge of the data bank over in Milwaukee. I sent him the profile that I developed from these stains. And he searched all the state, the convicted offender, state convicted offender database. Now, let's think about this, right? How did Dan Haas get a hit on Steven Avery's STR-DNA profile in the Wisconsin DNA databank? Because you have to ask yourself this question. What DNA source, was it blood, buccal swab, etc., did it come from, and who submitted it to the convicted offender database prior to 2005? Remember, Steven Avery was originally arrested in 1985. Okay, so on November the 9th, 2005, Steven Avery was arrested and a buccal swab was obtained from him for DNA analysis by Culhane. We can see that on the left-hand side with the arrow pointing to buccal swab. However, no bloods, and you can see that, were taken at the time. Now, Sheriff Pagel was questioned about this. Question. Lastly, for point of clarification, since I am not really asking questions to make a record, the arrest on the 9th of November of Mr. Avery, was that for what's called a status offence? That is, having been a convicted felon who had possessed a firearm, not an arrest for homicide or any related charges. Is that right? Answer, that is accurate. Now remember, a buccal swab was taken because Steven Avery was under arrest, and he was under arrest for possession of a firearm. But the question is, how did the DNA profile of Steven Avery, how did that get picked up before this buccal swab was taken of Steven Avery in 2005? Very, very interesting indeed. Okay, so now we can see another report, and we can see here that there's an item BU, which is the buccal cell standard, reportedly collected from Steven Avery that we saw on the previous page. And we have item EF, which were 3 pap smear slides reportedly collected from Teresa Halbach. And these were collected by investigator Tom Fassbender. So what Culhane would have done, she would have prepared genomic DNA samples from item BU, which is the buccal swab from Steven Avery that just was recently obtained, and item EF, which were the pap smear slides reportedly from Teresa Halbach. And she would have done a PCR STR DNA analysis on the DNA samples. So we can see here that once she got the results, and I quote, the profile previously developed from items A6, A8, A9, A12, which are all from the Toyota RAV4, B1, B3, B4, B5, which are all from the Pontiac Grand Am, and C, which is the key, issued November the 14th, 2005 by this analyst, is consistent with the profile developed from the buccal cell standard of Steven Avery, item BU. This profile is not consistent with the profiles developed from the buccal cell standards of Alan Avery or Brian Dassey. And furthermore, as Cherie Culhane wrote, the profile previously developed from the soda can, item A14, and the reddish brown stain, item A1, from the cargo area of the RAV4 vehicle is consistent with the profile developed from the pap smear slide reportedly collected from Teresa Halbach, item EF. So here is the full genomic DNA profile that Cherie Culhane had obtained from the buccal swab, item BU. Now remember that buccal swab was obtained on November the 9th. So here's the upshot. DNA from Steven Avery and Teresa Halbach were found inside the Toyota RAV4, which was labelled item A by Cherie Culhane. But the question is, how did Steven Avery's DNA as blood get inside the Toyota RAV4? And when was Steven Avery's DNA profile placed in the convicted offender database? Okay, so what I did is I went to the Wisconsin Department of Justice website and I wanted to find out all about how they collected DNA samples. And I found the information very, very interesting indeed. And I quote, "The DNA Databank Unit is responsible for receiving, verifying acceptability, and processing reference DNA samples from convicted offenders and a subset of arrestees. The reference DNA profiles obtained from these samples are then uploaded in the Wisconsin DNA Databank. The Wisconsin DNA Databank contains over 300,000 offender and arrestee DNA profiles. The Wisconsin DNA Databank is maintained in accordance with Wisconsin State Statutes 16577. To compare DNA profiles electronically, Wisconsin uses a tool called the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS, which is managed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. CODIS includes DNA profiles collected from known convicted offenders and arrestees, as well as unknown missing persons, unidentified human remains, and crime scene evidence. CODIS enables federal, state, and local forensic laboratories to share DNA profiles, thereby linking crime scenes to each other or to a reference DNA sample collected from a known arrestee or convicted offender. Through the expansion of database laws, the number of DNA profiles being searched in CODIS continues to dramatically increase. When a match occurs, the DNA Databank executes a series of steps to confirm the information and DNA profiles, and then provides the identifying information to law enforcement as an investigative lead. Now remember, that's exactly what Cherie Culhane had called it. Wisconsin has provided more than 10,737 investigate leads since 2001. Data collected from these investigative leads demonstrates the value of the program. About 35% of cases producing an investigative lead are a violent crime such as homicide or sexual assault. And I continue. DNA Databank reference sample collection. Department of Corrections personnel, law enforcement officers, or other trained personnel collect samples from convicted offenders and those arrested for qualifying violent felonies. These samples are collected pursuant to Wisconsin state statutes. And to facilitate consistency in training and high quality reference DNA sample collection throughout Wisconsin, the DNA Databank kits are offered at no cost to law enforcement agencies. And then it goes on to say where you can actually get these kits. Now, what I also found very interesting is this. If you're shown to be innocent of a crime, you can also have what is known as expungement. And that means, and I'll quote, an expungement is the complete removal of a DNA profile from CODIS and the physical destruction of the associated DNA sample and information pursuant to Wisconsin state statutes. And basically you then have to provide legal documentation in order to get your sample and your DNA profile out of a CODIS. But here's the big question, right? Where did Steven Avery's STR-DNA profile actually come from? Well, if we look at the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory Bureau, the DNA Databank qualifying offences. Well, there's no doubt that Steven Avery would have qualified, except, remember, yes, he was in prison for a wrongful conviction for the following offence: first or second degree sexual assault. But if you have a look at the date, it says here any felony committed in Wisconsin on or after January the 1st, 2000, or any of the following violations on or after August the 12th, 1993. Well, Steven Avery was actually arrested in 1985. So how did his DNA profile get into the database? Because remember, when Cherie Culhane had a search done, up popped Steven Avery's name. So when did he provide a DNA sample so it could go inside that database? Well, if we have a look at the Innocence Project page, we can see that it's called an incident date. It took place on the 29th of July, 1985. And furthermore, Steven Avery was exonerated on the 11th of the 9th, 2003, where he was in prison for 18 years. And his conviction, if you have a look at it, was sexual assault, attempted murder, false imprisonment. So the key question is, when did Steven Avery provide a DNA sample for the DNA Databank? Unbelievable, I found this article on the internet, and it's entitled DNA Extraction on Arrest, Maryland versus King and Wisconsin's New Extraction Law. And believe me, it was a very, very interesting case indeed. And I just so happened to find a very interesting part in that document, and I'll read it out to you. Wisconsin DNA Extraction Law in Flux. Now note the date. Until passage of the new law in 2013, Wisconsin law allowed the warrantless extraction of DNA only from persons convicted of any felony, of one or more of a limited number of misdemeanors, or of corresponding juvenile offences. Persons found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect of certain crimes, and persons found to be sexually violent. Police officers could extract that specimen either by a pinprick of the fingertip to obtain a blood sample, or by an oral swab to obtain a saliva sample. Once the state crime lab analyzed the sample in the manner described above, the lab generated a DNA profile that it included in the state's DNA databank and shared with the federal government's CODIS databank. Unlike other states, Wisconsin required, now note this, Wisconsin required that the crime lab destroy the biological sample after generating and storing the profile. And it's actually Wisconsin Statute 165.77.3. Now remember, this was the statute before 2013, which means if we have a look at Steven Avery's case, this statute applied, and I'll read it out. The laboratory shall destroy specimens obtained under this subsection after analysis has been completed and the applicable court proceedings have concluded. Now, we need to have a look at where on earth was a DNA sample taken from Steven Avery and a DNA genomic profile was done and submitted to the database. When did this take place? Okay, let's have a look at this very horrible incident, and that was the brutal attack and sexual assault of Penny Beernsten. This occurred in 1985. Cherie Culhane was the forensic analysis at the Steven Avery trial in 1985-1986, and you can actually find her testimony on our Foul Play Library website. And I quote, question. This, I believe, was Dennis Vogel who was asking these questions, the DA, the prosecuting DA. Question. All right, how long have you been doing that in terms of your own experience in hair comparisons? Answer. I did that in the capacity when I worked for the Jefferson Parish Crime Lab, and I've also done that since as a routine procedure since I've been at the laboratory here. Question. Do you have an opinion as to approximately how many cases you have worked on in which you've been asked to make hair comparisons? Answer. Hundreds of cases. I don't know an exact number. Question. Do you have an opinion as to how many individual hair samples you've actually looked at and tested under a microscope and compared? Answer. That would have to be hundreds or so. Most cases that involve some sort of sexual assault, there is hair to be examined, so it's a routine procedure that's done. Now, the reason why this is important is that years down the track, of course, the FBI and other forensic laboratories deemed hair analysis or hair comparison to be junk science, right? And Steven Avery was convicted on hair analysis comparison done by Cherie Culhane. And the scary part is she actually admitted to have done hundreds of these cases. And one wonders whether people that have been put in prison for sexual assault based on this hair analysis have actually appealed. Now, Cherie Culhane was also questioned about this in the Steven Avery trial in 2007. Question. Okay, and just so we understand, there were no DNA tests back in 1985? Answer. Correct. Question. You were testifying about a type of so-called science known as microscopic hair comparison analysis, right? Answer. Correct. So the important thing here, guys, is that only hairs were compared in 1985. No DNA analysis was done. Okay, so we now progress from when Steven Avery was in prison. And from 1986 to 1994, Steven appeals his conviction up to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. All his appeals are denied. And in 1994, Stephen Glynn and Robert Hynek agreed to re-examine Steven Avery's case. And here are images of both Stephen and Robert. They were Stephen's post-conviction lawyer. Okay, now, Judge Hazelwood ordered for the testing of the following material, biological samples: fingernail scrapings, pubic hair, and the victim's whole blood sample. But note, this is what also the judge said, Judge Hazelwood said. It is further ordered that the Health Services Unit at Fox Lake Correctional Institution obtain a DNA sample from the defendant, Steven A. Avery, as requested by Laboratory Corporation of America, and forward that sample as directed to Laboratory Corporation of America. And this, as you can see down the bottom, is Steven Avery's 1996 EDTA blood vial. That blood sample was collected by Marlene at Fox Lake Correctional Institute. Okay, Now, we can see here that LabCorp did the forensic analysis, right? So they tested all the samples, including a blood sample from Steven Avery. They extracted DNA and they did PCR reactions. And as you can see here, they tested only 3 loci: TPOX, THO1, and CSF. And they looked at the alleles of Steven Avery, Penny Beernsten, and then the alleles that were found underneath the fingernail scrapings. And what you can see here, there was an additional allele, allele number 8, in the TPOX locus. That allele number 8 did not belong to either Penny or to Steven. However, the judge was not prepared to give Steven the benefit of the doubt, and he remained in prison. Now note, in this particular case, only 3 loci were tested. Cherie Culhane had no role in this testing whatsoever. It was done by LabCorp. So in essence, it'll be very unlikely that LabCorp would have submitted those loci to any database. And the reason why I'm confident is that Cherie Culhane actually did genomic DNA profiling of both Steven's mother and father. So we actually know the full genomic profile of the parents and also of Steven Avery. Now, what is very, very interesting here is that the results for those 3 particular loci were not exactly the same as what LabCorp found in 1996. So if we have a look at TPOX, we know from the 2005 results, he has 2 alleles, 9 and 11. Well, the LabCorp results were exactly the same, 9 and 11, all perfect. However, for the THO1 locus, Cherie Culhane got a 9.3 allele, whereas LabCorp got a 10. And for the CSF 1PO locus, Steven Avery is actually 12. He has the 12 allele, whereas LabCorp got a 7. Now, I did a presentation and I actually was able to explain why LabCorp's results were different. And these were due to PCR errors. Now remember, this was 1996. The techniques, the PCR primers were not optimized as they were in 2005. The 2005 results are the ones to look at. Now that's important. Why? Because even if the 1996 LabCorp's DNA results were entered into CODIS, they would not have identified Steven Avery in 2005 because LabCorp had made DNA typing errors. And by the way, 3 loci are simply not enough to identify a unique individual in the database. So clearly, LabCorp could not have entered in those results into a database. All right, and now we come to a very interesting phase, and that was the Wisconsin Innocent Project that had started at 2002. They picked up Steven Avery's case. Now, if you note here, again, it was Judge Hazelwood, and he demanded new forensic testing. Now, notice point number 6, and I'll read it out. Comparison standards of victims, this will be Penny, head hair and pubic hair, and Steven Avery's head hair and pubic hair. So they obtained this new forensic evidence. And the judge, Hazelwood, said, the sheriff's deputy shall transport the evidence while maintaining the chain of custody, And guess where it went? Yep, the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory. That's exactly where Cherie Culhane worked. And the judge ordered that the state crime lab would do PCR testing. So PCR STR testing on those samples. But wait a minute. The actual laboratory needed a standard from Steven Avery in order to compare the results to. So we can see here that all the items were wrapped up, placed in an envelope, and they were sent to the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory for forensic testing. A chain of command was held and all the documentation was in order. Now this is where it gets really, really interesting. The hair and fingernail cuttings or scrapings, they were held in the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department in an office, and they were picked up by Detective Sergeant James Lenk. But here is where we come up with this very unusual item, and that's called item W. Now I'll read it out. One sealed envelope containing buccal swab standards reportedly recovered from Steven Avery. Now, if we have a look at this, the date is the 9th of the 9th, 2003. So item W is actually a buccal swab for DNA analysis extraction, and it came from Steven Avery. Now, Cherie Culhane was questioned about this at the Steven Avery trial. I quote, this attorney Gunn, yes, if you would describe what's in the envelope. The court, go ahead. A, this is a manila envelope, says Marie Beth Variali. By the way, Marie Beth Variali was the supervisor of Cherie Culhane. I continue. These are my markings, my initials, the lab number and the item designation. This is actually samples that are used to collect DNA bank samples. It's just a kit that we have. Inside the kit is a sealed white envelope with the laboratory case label and item designation W, my initials. And then this is the cut that I made when I took the sample out, and it's been resealed with my initials across it. Question. Explain a little more to the jury exactly what that contains and when you seal it and how you sealed it. Answer. When samples are collected for the Wisconsin State, the CODA system, the database, convicted offender samples, these pre-printed kits are used. It says Wisconsin DNA Databank, and sometimes there are also other police agencies will sometimes use these to collect standards from individuals. So there's some paper, there's some documentation here as to where this kit came from, and there's some instructions here if you were going to submit this to the data bank. There is a place for a fingerprint on here, which I really don't know anything about. But I received it in this condition. With this was completely sealed, and we placed our barcode from the lab across the top here, and I signed and initialed and dated it. And then when I took my sample out, I cut along the top edge here. So essentially what Cherie Culhane received was a buccal swab, item W. And she obviously opened up the package and she used the buccal swab in order to do a DNA prep from the buccal swab. The swabs are, and I continue, the swabs are actually inside this white envelope here. This is just a piece of paper that's stuck to the envelope. So the swabs are inside this envelope. When I took my sample, I split the top and pulled out the swabs. Notice, swabs. So more than one buccal swab was done. Sampled the swabs, put it back and sealed, resealed it This is the evidence tape in the lab and initialed it. Question: can you tell if that is the buccal swab that corresponds to, I believe, Exhibit 344, where the evidence was turned over, signed for by Detective Remaker? Answer: yes. They both have the same lab number, M851051, and they both have the item designation of W. So this is I went to the Wisconsin website, and this would be the form that Cherie Culhane would have filled in. Okay, I also found how the DNA sample is actually collected. So it's a kit, and a buccal swab is taken, and then the kit is sealed up and then sent to the crime lab. So this will be the exact same procedure that would have happened with Steven Avery. All right, so we can see here Exhibit 344, and it shows that item W is on the list, and it contains, and I quote, one sealed envelope containing buccal swab standards reportedly recovered from Steven Avery. So once Cherie Culhane had finished with the forensic evidence, it was then returned to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Office, and we can see the recipient was Detective Dave Remaker. All right, now if we have a look at CASO, now remember, Steven Avery has been arrested, charged with the murder of Teresa Halbach. Well, lo and behold, a big panic set in, and Mark Wiegert asked Detective Remaker to find what type of forensic evidence that belonged to Steven Avery, what they were holding, what they had in their storage. And yes, indeed, they found the buccal swab. They also found envelopes containing pubic hair, head hair, and fingernail scrapings. But what is interesting is that there was no blood or any blood samples located in either one of those packages. And if you remember, the 1996 blood vial they didn't know about, that was stored elsewhere. Now, I read and I quote, Detective Remaker stated that those were the only two packages located in their evidence room that contained any specimens regarding Steven Avery. But this is very, very interesting, because clearly this was before June the 30th, 2013. This is when the Wisconsin law was changed. And I'll read again. Wisconsin Statute 16577, subsection 3. The laboratories shall destroy specimens obtained under this subsection after analysis has been completed and the applicable court proceedings have concluded. Well, lo and behold, what is the MTSO doing with the buccal swabs? Right? By right, they should have been destroyed because a DNA sample was prepared, and this was part of Steven Avery's exoneration. So he was exonerated in 2003 by, guess who? Cherie Culhane. So the MTSO should not have had that buccal swab in its possession. This took place, the exoneration took place in 2003, and the law was very, very clear. They had to destroy the buccal swab, right? They were not meant to keep it. So, was the state actually concerned that Steven Avery's buccal swab from 2003 was being kept? Answer, you bet it did. And if we have a look at this exchange, this happened in Steven Avery's trial. Very, very interesting. I quote Attorney Buting, Judge, what it is a record regularly kept in the course of her business. she's going to be able to easily identify it. She's talked about the 2003 exoneration. It shows that Mr. Avery's buccal swabs. The court, is your microphone on? Attorney Beauty, yes. It shows that Mr. Avery's buccal swabs that used to be in the custody of the crime lab were sent back to the Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department in 2003. The court, all right, I had understood that the blood that was in the clerk's office was going to be the subject of the defense. How does this exhibit relate to that defense? Attorney Beauty, well, this witness, referring to Cherie Culhane, has testified that there's DNA found on items that she said she didn't see any blood, which could have come from buccal swabs. So she's already testified to that. So it's in play. Whether or not the Manitowoc Sheriff's Department had any of Mr. Avery's DNA in another form, which they did. The court, do we know if these items, which on their face at least say they are sealed, are still sealed somewhere in the Sheriff's Department's office? Attorney Beauty, that will be the subject of testimony later, I suspect. But at this point, all I'm doing is showing that they are not still at the crime lab, that they were sent back to the submitting agency, in this case, Detective Remiker. The court, Mr. Garn. Now, have a look at what what Attorney Garn says. Well, Your Honour, I guess I don't understand what's happening here. Now, are we switching that the planting did not come from the blood, but the planting now came from the buccal swabs of Steven Avery? Is that what the defense is stating now? Are they switching and changing their theory of defense, that it's no longer from the blood vial that's in the clerk's office, but now the planting took place with buccal swabs of Steven Avery? Now, this is new, Attorney Beauty. Judge, this is not new. We have alleged, look, they brought it up on direct, that there was DNA that was discovered that she said did not appear to come from blood. So it had to come from another source. This is another source that, according to this record at least, was sent back to Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department, and we will tie it up later when we establish that it is in fact still in the Manitowoc Sheriff's Department, or at least it was as of October or November the 5th, whatever, 2005. Attorney Gunn. Your Honour, I guess their offer of proof in this case, which the court required, and in their offer of proof, it was the planting that was done by the blood vial. Simple as that. That was it. Now they are going off on this buccal swab now that the planting may have come from there. And I don't, Attorney Beauty. Judge, I don't mean to cut counsel off, but it is in response to testimony they elicited here. And some of the DNA apparently did not come from blood. Now, we have a right to respond to that, and this is a response. It is not an explanation for the blood in the RAV4. The court. Right. Attorney Beauty, maybe an explanation for some of the other. The court. My recollection is that the previous contested hearing involved the blood vial. I don't know that I was asked to rule on anything other than the vial. I believe the evidence first came up at that point, that there was some DNA evidence of Mr. Avery, apparently not from blood, that was found, if I recall correctly, on the Toyota key and on the hood latch. And so I don't think I can say that this exhibit would not be relevant. The state is free to show in rebuttal or as part of its case in chief that these samples are still sealed somewhere in the sheriff's office. I think it is relevant. So after we get back from our break, I will allow the defense to pursue this matter. And Attorney Gahn later said, correct, the critical piece of evidence is what is going to be inside that envelope, and that will be the buccal swabs that Miss Culhane used to do the exoneration testing for the Innocence Project in 2003. And that we want to show, Your Honour, is that these were not reopened and used to swipe on a key or a hood latch. But I tell you what, Attorney Buting was very, very close when he talked about the buccal swabs. However, what if Cherie Culhane still had Steven Avery's genomic DNA that was prepared from the 2003 swab? Now, let's come up with a possible scenario. Now, Cherie Culhane would have obtained item W. It's a buccal swab of Steven Avery. Cherie Culhane had extracted the DNA from the buccal swab in 2003, and this was part of his exoneration. She would have done a PCR STR analysis, and she would have obtained the full genomic DNA profile back in 2003. Now think about this. She had the appropriate kit that came with that swab. Steven Avery's STR DNA profile is then submitted to the Wisconsin DNA database by none other than Cherie Culhane. She had the kit. So remember, Steven Avery, even though he was exonerated, was a felon. So Cherie Culhane, having obtained Steven Avery's full genomic profile, could have indeed placed it within the database, but she apparently didn't tell anyone. Item W, which is the swab, is later returned to Remaker from the MTSO. However, technically speaking, it should have been destroyed. And remember, this was before 2013, and the Wisconsin statute is 16577 subsection 3. Now, if Cherie Culhane actually keeps the DNA in either her cupboard or ideally stored in a freezer, she now has pure genomic DNA from Steven Avery in 2003. Now, I'm not saying this happened. However, DNA from Steven Avery could easily be used for planting and other nefarious activity, such as planting blood in the RAV4, the key, and the hood latch. And the amazing thing is, this all came from a sample from Steven Avery that was used to exonerate him in 2003. So we can see how Cherie Culhane gets a hit in the DNA database in 2005 when she swabbed the RAV4, the Grand Dam, and from the key. And the reason why the database pulled out Steven Avery's profile is because Cherie Culhane added the DNA profile in the database, likely sometime in 2003. So, why is having genomic DNA so powerful? Now, this, of course, is speculation, right? Not saying it happened, but it's another way you can plant Steven Avery's blood without actually having Steven Avery's blood. How do you do it? How can you produce fake blood for planting? Actually, it's surprisingly very, very easy to do. What you do is you take blood from an adult male, fresh blood, and the tube doesn't contain any EDTA in it at all. You then centrifuge the tube down, you spin it down, and the red blood cells, because of their weight, is trapped down the bottom of the tube. The white blood cells and the platelets form what is known as a buffy coat, and they're in the center of the tube, and on top is the fluid-filled part of the blood known as the plasma. Now, why is this important? What you simply do is you isolate the red blood cells. Now, the red blood cells themselves have no nucleus, no mitochondria. That means that the red blood cells themselves contain no genomic DNA at all. All one has to do is squirt in a bit of genomic DNA from Steven Avery, and that was prepared from the item W swab that Cherie Culhane had in the crime lab. You add that, you can prepare this at any time you want. You add the DNA to the red blood cells. Then you plant that blood, so-called blood, in the RAV4. And you do this after it leaves the Avery salvage yard. Because remember, no one noted any blood in the RAV4 at the Avery salvage yard. Now, the scary thing is this. If you take a swab of that blood, it's going to be presumptive positive for blood when you do the phenolphthalein test. When you do a PCR extraction, it's going to give you a full genomic DNA profile belonging to Steven Avery because it contains his DNA that's been added to the red blood cells. And furthermore, it's going to be EDTA free. So if you give these swabs to the FBI, they're not going to find any EDTA whatsoever. Now, why am I highly suspicious that Cherie Culhane could have done this? Well, Cherie Culhane had years of experience in serology, okay, in serology forensics, such as testing blood, semen, and saliva. She knew all about the properties of blood. Furthermore, when she gave her opening presentation, it's actually quite chilling. Cherie Culhane was fully aware that white blood cells had a nucleus. That is, they contain genomic DNA. And I quote this from the Steven Avery trial. Question. Now, I would like to shift out of the laboratory just for a moment, and I would like to ask you to describe for the jury where DNA is found in the human body, and we'll put up this slide. Answer. This slide illustrates many of the sources that we find biological evidence. When we're developing a profile, any cell in the body that has a nucleus, the center portion of the cell has DNA in it. So what we're looking for is nucleated cells to develop a profile. Blood, semen, and saliva are probably our most common types of biological evidence. If we're looking at a blood sample, we're looking at the white blood cells because that's where the nucleus is. So Cherie Culhane knew full well that white blood cells contain nuclei, red blood cells did not. Now, Jerome Buting questioned Cherie Culhane about the possibility of planting, and this was an intriguing question. And what you're really saying is that as far as you can tell, Mr. Avery is the original source of the DNA that you find in those stains, correct? Answer. I'm saying that his profile was consistent with what I found in the stains. Question. Right, but what you are not saying is anything about how his DNA found its way inside the RAV4, are you? Answer. No. Question. Your tests aren't designed to tell us how his DNA found its way into the location where you ultimately swabbed, are they? Answer. No. Question. What you're looking for is a DNA profile, and if you find it, then you compare it to a known reference sample, in this case, Mr. Avery, right? Answer. Right. Question. But if someone else planted Mr. Avery's DNA or blood or both inside that vehicle, you would know that from these tests, would you? Answer, no. So you cannot tell this jury with any degree of certainty, scientific or otherwise, that Steven Avery was himself ever inside that vehicle, can you? No. No meaning correct. Answer, that's correct. So if we have a look at that swab could well have fake blood on it. And if you extract the DNA from that swab, you're going to come up with Steven Avery's full genomic DNA profile. So, in essence, the planting of blood or swapping cannot be ruled out. And of course, who did the swabbing? Cherie Culhane. Who did all the PCR analysis? Cherie Culhane. Who had Steven Avery's buccal swab in 2003? Cherie Culhane did. So she had all the biological material at her disposal. Okay. Now, Cherie Culhane had made some very interesting statements because remember, she admitted putting Steven Avery's DNA profile in the CODIS system in 2003, but she strongly implied it. Question. Did some time come in the year 2003 when you were asked to review that case and look at the evidence again? Answer, yes, it was. Question, and were you asked to perform any type of DNA testing in that case? Answer, yes. Question, and was it your understanding that Mr. Avery had maintained his innocence in that 1985 case? Answer, yes. Question, do you remember exactly what were the evidentiary items that you examined in that case? Answer, yes, I do. Question, could you tell the jury about those? Answer, in that case, I examined 11 pubic hairs that were taken from a victim's pubic hair combings. Those were taken in a sexual assault case to recover any hairs that had been transferred during contact. There were 11 pubic hairs. Yeah, 11 pubic hairs. And I attempted DNA analysis on all 11. Only 2 of those hairs gave me a DNA profile. In a hair sample, we're actually looking at the root portion of the hair with cells attached to it. 2 of those hairs gave me results. 1 hair was from a male, 1 hair was from a female. The hair from the male was entered into the CODIS system and hit on an individual. Yeah, what Cherie Culhane actually meant was the STR DNA profile was entered into the CODIS system. Question. Now, you are going to have to explain for the jurors a little bit. What do you mean by the CODIS system and what do you mean by hit on an individual? Answer. The CODIS system is a database of DNA profiles that is maintained by the FBI. Forensic labs contribute samples, evidence samples, to these databases. They are also a database of convicted offenders, and anyone who has been convicted of a felony, it's different rules in different states, has to submit samples to this database. So when we have an evidence sample, it's entered into the database and it's searched against this index. And in this case, that male profile was entered into that system and searched. And what was the result of that search? It hit on another individual. Question, when you say another individual, you mean someone other than Steven Avery? Answer, that's correct. Question, and you yourself performed this testing? Answer, yes, I did. Question, and because of the testing that you performed, and because of the search of the CODIS data bank, what happened to Mr. Avery? Have a look at this answer. Answer, I believe he was freed from prison. Question, and that was because of the testing that you did. Answer, correct. Question, basically, did you follow the same protocol that you did in testing that case, testing the 1985 case, that you followed in this case? Answer, yes, I did. Did you basically follow the same steps and procedures in the DNA testing? Answer, yes. So this is very, very interesting. Cherie Culhane had entered Gregory Allen's STR DNA profile, that's from the pubic hair DNA, into CODIS. But here's the big question. Did she also, at the same time, enter Steven Avery's STR DNA profile obtained from the buccal swab DNA preparation? If so, why? Steven Avery was exonerated for the 1985 rape and assault on Penny Beernsten. And as you can see here, it was Gregory Allen who was the perpetrator of that crime, not Steven Avery. Okay, now one of our members from Foul Play was kind enough to ask Jerome Buting regarding about Steven's entry, STR profile entry into CODIS. How did it get in there prior to 2005? Jerome Buting responded by saying, I don't know for sure, but it was probably added long before 2005. The law changed at some point to include all convicted felons, including those who were then in prison. He was probably added before he was exonerated or even after for a prior felony conviction, like the pointing the gun incident. And that occurred when he pointed the rifle at his cousin, Sandra Morris. So it's very, very likely that, remember, it was Cherie Culhane that produced Steven Avery's STR DNA profile in 2003 from item W. And it's very, very likely it was Cherie Culhane that put Steven's STR DNA profile in CODIS, right? So item W should have been destroyed, but it was still kept at the MTSO. Okay, so let's summarize this. What biological samples did the MTSO and or the WSCL have that belonged to Steven Avery prior to his 2005 arrest? Well, they had Steven Avery's 1996 vial of blood that had EDTA in it. That item W, which was the buccal swab. This was used to prepare genomic DNA for Steven Avery's exoneration. Cherie Culhane would have prepared pure genomic DNA that she would have used for his exoneration testing. They had pubic hair and they also had head hair, all belonging to Steven Avery, and they still had those items. Now, here's the scary bit. The state had biological samples from Steven Avery prior to 2005, and they could have been used to frame him for the murder of Teresa Halbach in 2005. Why is this scary? Well, because the state had a very powerful motive to frame Steven Avery, because Steven Avery had a $36 million lawsuit against the county, the sheriff, and the DA. All of these items, except the blood vial, went through the hands of Cherie Culhane. So, was Cherie Culhane potentially a compromised laboratory technician? I believe that she was. And if we have a look at this email that Ken Kratz sent to Cherie Culhane, right down the bottom it's got, Mark Wiegert is checking the 1985 Manitowoc blood sample taken to make sure that what it was. So you, in capitals, tested that sample back then. How bizarre is that? Were you also the analyst that got him out of prison in 2003? Hint, hint, hint. And of course, we must never forget what Tom Fassbender, the principal agent, notice he's the DCI agent, said to Cherie Culhane very early on in the investigation, and I quote, tried to put her in his house or garage. Now, I can't stop thinking about Chief Deputy Eugene Couchet. During the depositions, he said a couple of really bizarre things during Steven Avery's civil lawsuit deposition. And I'll quote, this is Walter Kelly. Are you saying you doubt the DNA examination? Couchet, that there was a match? I believe there was a match. Walter Kelly, okay, so you, Couchet, has DNA evidence been fabricated before? Yes. Walter Kelly, do you think that happened here? Couchet, I don't know, which was a really bizarre thing to say. So, the question is, why would Jean Couchet be making comments about the fabrication of DNA evidence? And of course, Cherie Culhane was the head of the DNA unit, and she's the one that handled the forensic evidence of Steven Avery in 1985, 2003, and 2005. Look, thank you very much, guys. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have done this presentation in honor of Richard, also known as Erekose. My name is Dr. Silkman, and I'm from the Foul Play team. God bless.